Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to give a talk to a group that has such a diverse interest in aging. Today I'm going to focus on memory efficiency and value-directed remembering in older adults. And one fascinating thing about memory is that it typically consists of many different types of information. So you might remember the last time you were in this room. You might remember what you were eating for lunch. You might remember the typical weather outside. Hopefully you might remember what the talk was about and even the person's name. So this suggests many different items of information that are bound together to form a very complex, rich memory of the past. What I'm interested in is how memory changes with age, especially in terms of remembering these associations. And I want to focus on, halfway through the talk, how younger and older adults can learn to focus on the important information. So instead of remembering the color of the person's tie last week, you might want to remember the topic of the discussion, these sorts of things, and how younger and older adults can learn to do this very efficiently. So the distinction between item and associative information has a long and rich history in cognitive psychology that I won't go into too much detail, but items typically are individual units of information, such as a name or a face, whereas associative information involves the binding of these units, so remembering the proper name that goes with the face. And these associations are necessary to remember when you see someone what their name is, as opposed to retrieving an incorrect name. And this is something that we often have trouble with, but we often learn at very early ages too. So if I said, this is Clifford, you might think, well, have I met a Clifford before? And I say, well, in fact, this is the Clifford I want you to remember. And I say, oh, okay, I can remember. This is Clifford, the big red dog. Even my 1-year-old daughter can do this. She's learning to do it, although she called Clifford God the other day. I was a little concerned about it, but she really likes Clifford. Some other examples that involve learning associations are learning a new language. So if you're learning a new language, any new language, typically you'll begin with the words you know and then try and bind the new language term to these words. Other examples, and something I'm very interested in, is how we assign and remember values. So this could be in the context of remembering prices. So if you're interested in buying a new iPhone or an iPod and you see it's $189 at one store but $169 at another, you need to remember these associations so you can make an informed purchase. So the focus of my talk today will be looking at whether there is in fact an associative deficit in old age. A lot of research has shown that this is indeed the case. Older adults have trouble remembering names and faces. But that this might be influenced by the materials of the task demand. So I'll describe a few experiments that look at these sorts of issues, and more specifically how expertise or prior knowledge can reduce this associative deficit. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about some work that we're doing in our lab now that looks at selectivity and strategic control, and really seeing whether younger and older adults can focus on remembering important information at the expense of less important information. And this is a concept I refer to as value-directed remembering. Okay, so like I said, previous research suggests that there is an associative deficit for older adults, meaning that older adults often have difficulty remembering source information. They might be able to remember a joke, but they can't remember who told them the joke, or an important headline, but maybe not where they read it. So this might suggest older adults have difficulty remembering source or context information and might reflect some impairments in the binding process. And a lot of experimental work has looked at this, and I'll show you just one example, something that we've been interested in. A lot of this has been done with looking at unrelated word pairs. So this is a very classic associate learning. I'll show you an experiment we've done, and you can actually try it out yourselves, where we extend this to pairs of faces. So now it's not so verbal anymore. You're going to study faces, two faces. You need to remember each face, but also these faces are paired together for a later memory test. Okay? So you might have to pause even just for a second. You'll be presented these faces. Just remember the faces, but also that they're paired together. So then there'd be some delay, and then eventually you'd be given a memory test. And hopefully none of those faces were familiar to any of you. But you might notice some were younger and some were older, so that's an important point. After this delay, we present pairs of faces, and you need to decide whether these pairs of faces are old pairs you've seen before, so you've seen both faces and that they were paired together, or you need to indicate whether they're rearranged, so two faces you've seen before but not together, or if they're completely new faces. You haven't seen these faces in the last set of slides, okay? So here's your test. Have you seen these people together? Have you seen both of them, but they were separate, or is it a new pair?
New.
Okay, and the answer is separate. Excellent. Okay, how about this pair? A little more confusion. It's actually a new pair. Okay, so we hadn't seen these two people before. And this pair? Together, all right. And then I think we have one more. Okay, so just to summarize, if you have any questions, please just feel free to interrupt me. We tested younger and older adults in this experiment, and we used younger and older faces to see if maybe younger adults would be better with young and old would be better with old. And we did find evidence for that, which is what's referred to as an own age bias. We also used several manipulations. So I said just try and remember that these two faces go together. A lot of older adults will say, well, why do they go together? I mean, you know. So we gave them orienting tasks to try and improve performance. Say, well, pretend that they're a couple. Pretend that they're married. Okay, so now you're really trying to use some sort of binding process. And then we even tried to make it even more rich, like, pretend they're a couple, and you need to tell us which one might win an argument. So you're now really comparing the two faces. So a lot of orienting tasks, but the results were fairly consistent. So this is the number of faces called intact or old. And these are the different item types. So these are ones that were, in fact, intact. So two faces you've seen before together. These were the rearranged ones. These were the kind of tricky ones. You've seen both faces before, but they weren't together. And then these are the completely new ones. And these are data from younger and older adults. So this is what we call a hit. All right? If you say old to an intact pair, that's your hit rate. And there were actually no age differences for younger and older adults. These age differences emerged for these rearranged pairs. Younger adults are making a fair number of false alarms, and especially for the older faces, the older age faces. But older adults, their false alarm rate is quite high, almost near 60%. So oftentimes older adults will say, I think I've seen those two faces together, when in fact they've seen those two faces but not together. And this is a finding that's been illustrated with word pairs, typically unrelated word pairs. We simply extended it by looking at faces. So this is some evidence that suggests, well, older adults do in fact make more errors for these rearranged lures. And the theory that really can explain this quite well is that older adults rely on familiarity in these cases. Both faces look familiar because they've seen them before, they just can't then remember, but that face was paired with someone else. So they might be more inclined to say, yeah, I think I've seen those two people together. So this is using familiarity as opposed to more detailed recollection, knowing that face was paired with another person. Larry Jacoby, who's part of this project, always thinks, you know, if you're at a party and you see a woman with another man, you should be able to tell that those people are not together and so on. But that didn't seem to work the way we thought it would. But here, associative information is not used by older adults in these sorts of situations. And one comment we've often got from older adults is saying, well, why would I remember that these two faces go together? I mean, they're very arbitrary. And that left me kind of scratching my head saying, well, most of the experiments we do involve trying to remember two arbitrary bits of information. These are situations where older adults don't do so well, but they're also saying, well, why should I even try and remember this association? In fact, oftentimes when we test this with unrelated word pairs like table, donkey, we'll say, well, why do those two words go together? Whereas younger adults will sit there and make a very elaborate image of a donkey standing on a table, and then do quite well. So I think that's an important point because that might determine what kind of processing you engage in. If you're already saying those two don't go together, why should I remember them? So this illustrates this point that maybe it's this binding of arbitrary units of information could lead to this associative memory deficit, and that there might be very little meaningful benefit to remembering these associations, despite the fact that the experimenter is encouraging you to do this. So to examine this in more detail, we looked at how people could find numerical information. And numerical information is interesting because on its own, it might not convey very much information. If I said 90, 52, 48, 14, 30. But when I pair it with other information, all of a sudden it can be interpreted in a deeper semantic network, let's say. So now all of a sudden 90 degrees Fahrenheit might be a hot day, an important election outcome, maybe how much you spent on rent last month, these sorts of things. Now you can remember these numbers in a more elaborate way. On the other hand, numbers can sometimes be very difficult to remember. I'm sure we've all struggled with trying to remember phone numbers, or if I ask you what was the room number for your hotel you stayed in a month ago, or the flight number that you were just on, very difficult to remember this information, typically because it's not important, but in many cases it is, like your social security number. So there might be different levels of specificity in terms of remembering numerical information and how this information is then bound to other information. So to look at this, again, in an experimental setting, we developed phrases that consisted of a number, an object, and a location. So we'd give subjects sentences that were something like, there are 36 horses on the farm. And then we'd later test them by giving them farm, and you need to recall what was on the farm, horses, but then also more specific detailed information, how many horses were on the farm. The idea being older adults might have trouble with this more specific information, possibly because it's fairly arbitrary. So this procedure, we presented 20 phrases, like I said, which consisted of a number, an object, and a location. We had two different conditions. One in which the object was related to the location. So horses on a farm, somewhat related. On the other hand, we had an unrelated condition as well. Nails in the bowl. Okay, so you could very well imagine nails in a bowl, but it might not be the first thing you imagine. So this is more unrelated. The number was always an arbitrary two-digit number. And then a test, like I said, presented with each location, such as farm or bowl, and you need to recall what was there and then how many. And this is what we found. This is a probability of correct recall. And this is for the objects that were related, so horses on the farm. But remember, the numbers are always, in this case, they're part of this related condition, but they're always just random two-digit numbers. And this is the unrelated condition. So these are nails in the bowl, and these are the numbers that were associated with those objects. Younger adults do fairly well. They do better at recalling the objects than they do with the numbers. And they're better in the related condition compared to the unrelated condition. But what we were specifically interested in is how older adults would do here, with the idea being that older adults might have difficulty remembering the specific numbers, but might do better with the related objects, but then have difficulty again with the unrelated objects. And for the most part, that's what we found. There were really no age-related differences for the related objects, recalling that there were horses on the farm. Both groups did worse with the numbers, but older adults again showed a substantial deficit in remembering the specific number. Then in the unrelated condition, a big age-related difference for the objects, the unrelated objects, which is similar in magnitude to the difference in these numbers. What was interesting, again, is we had some older adults who actually did quite well with the numbers. And after we ran a few of these, we started to catch on and say, well, what are you doing with these numbers? Why are you doing much better than some of your other colleagues who are in these experiments? And these older adults actually did fairly well with the numbers in the unrelated condition. In fact, did better than the younger adults. But their memory just wasn't better overall. I mean, slightly better than the other older adults, worse than the younger adults for the object. And it turned out that these individuals had a lot of training in accounting, or worked in banks for 20 to 30 years. So they would say, well, numbers have always been important to me, or I never like to forget, a precise number. And so they would do well, and they're not remembering all of them. But it's interesting, so we followed this up and found ourselves 12 older accountants. I got a lot of tax advice from these. It was right around tax time when we were doing this. But they would say to them it's always been important to remember specific numbers, and in these cases they pay more attention, although it's difficult to determine exactly why they were doing better, whether they're attending more to the information, maybe to them it was more important, or they had more experience. We never followed this up with younger people who were in accounting school, although that would be interesting. But it suggests that, and I don't think too many people would argue, what you've done for the past 30 years influences how you process and retain information. And these older adults who spent a lot of time working with numbers paid a lot of attention to the numbers in this task. So again, we find this kind of specific associative deficit for older adults in terms of remembering unrelated information and these specific numbers. Yeah.
In the example, you had two numbers. You had 77 and 63. So is there any effect of 10 or 36?
Any effects of the magnitude or size of the number? Or?
No, I mean because 77 is 27.
Yeah, that's a good question. We randomly chose numbers, so every once in a while there would be a double-digit number, but it would typically show up in either condition. But yeah, those sorts of issues are interesting. I'm fascinated with how people remember numbers, so anything related to that, I'm happy to focus on. But we did try and randomly assign those sorts of things. Sometimes lower digit numbers are easier to remember than higher digit numbers. We even have some evidence that even numbers are better remembered than odd numbers. Something I'd love to follow up on, but don't have as much time as I'd like to. Or follow up on these accountants and bookkeepers and test younger accountants or people in accounting school to see if it's really interest with numbers or experience with numbers that leads to these sorts of effects. But what seems to be the critical factor is the degree to which information can be meaningfully related to form new units. So these people who weren't accountants probably weren't paying much attention to the numbers, whereas horses on a farm made more sense. They could remember that. So we wanted to follow up on this in a little more detail by looking at, again, more real-world examples of how we remember associations. And one example could be when we go to the grocery store. So we often need to determine if something's a good deal or not, if we want to buy it, if it's cheaper somewhere else. So we looked at how prior knowledge or schematic support, the degree to which you can incorporate incoming information with previous information, can influence this binding process. And we looked at grocery items and their prices, partly because we all have a lot of experience doing this. So we looked at how people could remember market value items and prices, what we call regular prices. We also included overpriced items. So grocery items that were presented that people were familiar with, but the prices were much too high. And then we tested people with cued recall, in which we presented each item that they were shown, and they had to recall the price. With the idea being that older adults might be better at finding market value prices compared to unusual prices because more experience, and possibly engaging in more evaluative processing, which is something we define as when you're looking at something, you're determining if it's a good deal, you're determining if it's cheaper somewhere else, you're integrating it with prior experiences. I think we've all done this. So if I said, okay, here's cereal for $3.99, trying to remember that the cereal's $3.99. But then I presented ice cream, and maybe you know this is good ice cream. You never pay $17.59 for it. So this would be an overpriced item. But you're still asked to remember this price for a later test. Then there'd be some delay. And then later we'd present the items one at a time, and you need to recall the price. And all the prices end in 9. So if you can't remember, you should guess. But you should guess in a price that ends in 9. So now you need to recall the price of the cornflakes. Everyone can remember that. Now the price of the potty dust, and you know some bean price. And this was actually a really fun experiment because older adults would, I think there was some sort of emotional component that when they saw this ice cream for $17, they almost, I would never pay that price. But they make comments like, oh, this must be Whole Foods or something. The point is they're very engaged now in the task. So they're kind of comparing the price to what they might expect to pay and then saying that's not what they'd expect to pay. They'd even do it for the cornflakes, saying, $3.99 is actually a little bit more than I would pay for cornflakes. So they're really engaged even for the market value prices, such that I think when they later need to recall this information, they say, oh, this ice cream, I don't even want to look at it. It's so expensive. But then you need to try and remember the exact price, and older adults might say, oh, it was $20, or it was $15, or it was $17 something, $17.99. And so
when you talk about experience benefiting older adults, what kind of experience have you had in mind when you say experience?
Well, here that's I think an important point, because you could say older adults have a lot of experience grocery shopping, but so might younger adults. And in many cases, the prices have changed over 30 years. So that's a really important point.
I think the experience would hurt them.
Exactly, and I think that is a great point because that might lead to some interference. But in this case, the interference might help you incorporate I mean, these older adults have been grocery shopping recently, but they could also probably tell you cornflakes were once, 80 cents per box or something like that. But I completely agree, and when we published this, a few reviewers brought that up, said, well, older adults have more experience with grocery shopping, so that's why they might do fairly well in this task. And I brought up exactly your point, saying, well, they might also have more interference. But those are issues. So we did ask people how much experience do they have grocery shopping, which is kind of an open-ended question on a scale of 1 to 10. Older adults would typically say that 8, younger adults would say that 6.5. So maybe it's that the younger adults aren't going into grocery stores often, but I think younger adults know the price of ice cream or cereal. But I think that's a really interesting thing to examine, especially in the context if you want to talk about this as expertise. Are we experts in determining the prices of things? But I think that's a great point. Okay, I think I've previewed these results to a certain extent. This is recall accuracy. We presented 20 items, and we only scored people correct if they recall the exact price correctly. So if they said $3.99 for the cornflakes, they were correct. But if they said $3.79, or if they said $4, they were incorrect. So you had to get the price exactly correct, and that's why people didn't do all that well. So this is out of 20. This actually should go all the way to 20. People are doing fairly poorly in that remembering this precise price. But what's interesting is that younger and older adults don't show any differences. If anything, the older adults are doing slightly better than the younger adults. This is somewhat difficult to find in cognitive aging, a situation where young and old are doing just as well, although they might be doing just as well for different reasons. When we look at these unusual prices, so this is the ice cream for $17.59, there is an effect of this condition. Both groups are doing poorly relative to the regular price, but it's the older adults who can't remember these prices very well at all. Younger adults can still do somewhat well, but not as well as when the prices were the regular price. So this interaction tells us perhaps that older adults can remember these prices when they're consistent with what they might expect to pay, but when they're inconsistent, that's when older adults have difficulty remembering these associations. So older adults in these cases might benefit from what we call schematic support when remembering associations. On the other hand, younger adults can remember more precise and perhaps arbitrary associations. When I say the ice cream is $17.59, that's a very arbitrary association. We wanted to examine this in a little more detail by saying, well, can older adults still remember some sort of general link between these items such that they can remember the ice cream was about $15 or overpriced, but can't remember the precise price. So we used a very similar design. But in this case, we included underpriced items, overpriced items, and market value items. And then later when we tested people, they had to recall a price, but they also had to recall the value category. Was it overpriced, underpriced, or about market value? So as an example, you might see broccoli, but it's only 19 cents. So this is an underpriced item. Cookies for $11.89, overpriced item. And then pickles for $2.79. So this would be a market value price. And then later you'd be tested. You need to recall the price as well as the value category. And you could see situations where people might say, well, I can't remember the price exactly, but I know it was overpriced. I'll say $12. So they might not be independent. So you'd see the cookies. Can you remember the price? And then you'd say overpriced. So you might be getting some information just from recalling the price. The broccoli, you would remember, oh, that was underpriced. It was only 19 cents. Or maybe if you have more of a gist-based memory, you might say, oh, it was about 20 cents or less than 50 cents, but I know it was underpriced. And then pickles, $2.79. Great. So this is, again, exact price recall for the younger and older adults. There were 7 items in each condition. Okay, so again, we're only scoring it correct if you get the exact price ending in the 9. No age-related difference for the market value. Again, if anything, the older adults are doing better than the young. In some ways, I wish that actually was true, but statistically they're similar. But you get a large age-related difference for the overpriced and underpriced items. So, kind of mimicking our results from the first experiment, older adults can remember the prices when they're market priced, but have difficulty remembering the underpriced and overpriced items. But what we were more interested in this case, is how about remembering the general category? So if you can't remember how much the cookies were, can you still remember that they were overpriced? And this is what we found. This is for value classification. 7 items again. No age-related differences, and both groups are doing very well. Okay, so now when you're asking at a more general level, would you buy those cookies? You'd say, no way. They were $12 or they were overpriced. And both younger and older adults can remember kind of this gist-based information. And I find this especially interesting because it has implications. I mean, this happens to me often where you might go out to a restaurant and pay using a credit card and then maybe check your bill online or get a statement mailed to you and realize, okay, the restaurant has charged me on my credit card $86.17. Is that right? So I need to kind of think back, oh yeah, a week ago, that sounds about right. I had friends over, maybe we had wine, so maybe it could be $86. But if they said $88, would I notice the difference? Probably not. Right? If they said $120, then I'd probably say, oh, wait a second, that doesn't sound right. I don't tip that well or something. But these sorts of things might make older adults more susceptible to, let's say, credit card scams where prices are adjusted just a little bit. Older adults might be saying, well, that is consistent with what I typically pay at a restaurant, so give or take $1 or $2, I might not notice that difference. And we're also interested in how younger and older adults might be able to update information. So if I said, okay, that cereal that was once $3.99, now it's $3.69. Can you then later remember when I say how much was the cereal, can you remember that it's $3.69 and not $3.99? And you might say, yeah, I can remember that, that's important. I'm going to save that money. But most of the literature in cognitive aging would suggest that older adults couldn't do this. Because oftentimes in these paradigms where I say table is paired with donkey, and then later I say table is paired with wallet, and then I later cue you, what was table paired with? Older adults will often give you the first response. So, or depending on the situation, the second response, depending on what interval you use.
And what would younger adults do?
And younger adults can follow the directions quite well. You can say, if you need to update and remember the second association, so table wallet. So if I say table donkey, but then I change it to table wallet, I want you to tell me table wallet. Younger adults can do that. Older adults might have difficulty because they can't remember, wait, was it table wallet or was it table donkey? Which one came first? But in this sort of task, this grocery price task, maybe older adults would do fairly well. But I think we'd also want to include the condition where the prices go up, too. Right? So maybe the cookies were once $11.89. What if I made them $12.29? Would older adults notice those differences? And you might get interesting differences, maybe because we're more used to paying attention to things drop in price. That's when we attend to them and try and remember them. Younger adults might have more control over memory and can remember when things went up or down. But again, this might be related to experience, loosely defined, that we have when I'm going to the grocery store. But I think the critical thing is this form of evaluative processing. So the degree to which something fits your schema for what you might expect to pay for it, or you deciding, and a lot of the older adults would say, I'm not shopping at this grocery store, or these sorts of very emotional responses, so why, this just isn't right, and if it isn't right, I won't remember it. So this leads me to kind of the second part of my talk, which is really how we can focus on remembering important information. And this is important both for younger and older adults. So you might say, well, this talk is fairly long and maybe a little bit boring. If you could just tell me the important things, then I can leave and remember the important things and tell people what I learned, right? So really your job here is not to remember everything, but to try and focus on the important things. And this is something we often try and tell students. You don't need to read the entire textbook, or if you do read the entire textbook, you need to get the important information out of it. Oftentimes we'll have students who say, well, I've read the textbook 3 times and I still did poorly on the test. It's like, well, you're not focusing on the important things. Of course, the important things are whatever are on the exam for students. So students will often say, well, why don't you just tell me? What do I need to know for the test? Right? And it's like, well, that's your job to determine what you... So the point is we frequently try to assign value to information, and this is a very important skill. And there might be large individual differences here. And value then influences behavior and what we later remember. So this is an idea that we have some sort of strategic control over what we try and remember. in light of us not being able to remember everything. So if you know you're not going to remember everything about this talk, you might be strategic about trying to pick a few things that you thought were really important or interesting, or maybe some thoughts you had that you can then later remember. So this selection process influences what we rehearse and then later retain. And this idea that, well, if it's important, then I'll remember it, might be better captured, well, if it's important, then I'll try to remember it. And that's really an important thing for both younger and older adults, but there might be different effects of age here. So older adults may use value to guide memory in a very efficient way if they're aware that they can't remember everything. And oftentimes in some of the memory tasks we use, older adults will say, well, there are 80 word pairs, or the list was too long. You know, I can't remember all of them. And we say, well, we kind of design it that way so we can see which ones you remember and how much. They say, well, I know I can't remember everything, so what should I do? And that's actually a very interesting question, because it's like, in most of the tasks we use, we say, here's 80 words, try and remember them. But I think what's missing is, what if we said, well, some are more important than others, just like some parts of this talk are more important. In that case, older adults might be just as good as younger adults in terms of remembering the high-value information, but there might be larger age differences for low-value information. Of course, it's difficult to define high and low value unless we do it this way, by telling people what's high and low value. So we used a selectivity task developed by Watkins and Bloom, where words are assigned point values ranging from low, 1 point, to high, in this case 12 points, although high could be any number. And the task here is to maximize your score, which is the sum of the point values of the words that you recall. And this sort of paradigm allows people to be strategic in light of how much you can remember. And so this might sound a little abstract, so let's try this out. You're going to be presented with words, one at a time, in this case 12 words. Each word is going to be paired with a point value ranging from 1 to 12. The point value indicates how important it is to remember the word. You want to maximize your score. So if you can remember a few words, and they're the high value words, your score will be quite high. And then I'll give you feedback. I'll tell you how you do. But I'll tell you there's a trick. The words are presented fairly quickly, so you're not going to be able to remember all 12. Okay? Are we ready? All right, here we go. Okay, so now try and recall as many words as you can. You can just say them out loud if you want. Okay. It's tough. And you can't, most people probably will remember 3 or 4, maybe 5. But what's important here are which ones you remember. So I heard a lot of Ticket House Pizza. Ticket House Pizza, that's the 12, 11, and 10 point value words. So if you recalled 3 words, Ticket House Pizza, I'd say great, the score is 33. 12 plus 11 plus 10. But some of you would recall a few other words like apple or guitar or snow for whatever reason, which would supplement your score, but it might not be the next most valuable word. It might not be the 9-point word, it might be the 2-point word. So we are particularly interested in how many words people recall, which is what we often measure as quantity, but also, in this case, memory efficiency. So imagine these two scenarios. If you recall the highest value words, the 12, 11, 10, your score would be 33. And in fact, if we wanted to model this, an ideal person who only recalls 3 words would recall the 12, 11, and 10. So you're getting 33 out of, the best possible score of 33. On the other hand, if you recall some high value words, but also some lower value words, this will supplement your score. So this helps you. If you recall 4 words, the 12, the 10, the 7, and 3, your score would be 32. But you could have gotten a possible 42 if you recalled 12, 11, 10, and 9. So I won't go into this in too much detail, but we can look at efficiency here, all right? Because it looks like person A is slightly more efficient than person B. They're recalling fewer words, but their score is higher. Whereas person B recalls more words, but their score is lower. All right? So we have a measure both of quantity, but we also have a measure of efficiency, something I'm very interested in. I won't go into detail into this talk, but I'm happy to answer questions how we can try and model this or look at efficiency. What's important here is we repeat this many times, okay? So you just did one list, you recalled the words, and then an experimenter would say, great, your score is 24, or your score is 33, or your score is 60, or your score is 7. And then you can kind of take that feedback, and then on the next list, which would be different words, okay, so new words, you might then be more selective. You might realize, wow, those words are really going fast. Now I'm going to be a little more strategic and really just look for 12, 11, 10, and maybe one other. And that's, in fact, what older adults learn to do very well. And we were quite surprised because, according to some theories of cognitive aging, you might expect older adults to have trouble inhibiting low-value information. So older adults are thought to have difficulty controlling attention. In many cases, this is true. So if I say this word's only 2 points, can older adults say, well, I don't even want to study that one, I want to rehearse something else. So you might expect older adults to recall more of the low-value words. So this is the probability of recall as a function of the point value of the word. And what we found are younger adults are fairly sensitive to point value. They recall more of the high-value words than the low-value words. If memory is just worse in old age, we'd expect this function just to be shifted down, right? Or if older adults don't attend to value at all and just recall a bunch of words, we expect this function to be flat. And this is what we found. Older adults do worse than younger adults for these low-value words, but something interesting happens for the high-value words. In this case, older adults are doing just as well as younger adults for the high-value words. And what seems to be happening is, with successive lists, older adults learn, I can't remember all of these words, but I still want my score to be high. So I'm just going to focus on 12, 11, 10, maybe 9. And so their score is quite high. They're remembering the high-value words. Younger adults probably do this too, but then occasionally remember a lower-value word. So this is kind of interesting because it suggests that older adults can focus on high-value information and I think learn because, like I said, there are many lists. On the first list, younger and older adults are still figuring out the task, and oftentimes they're given feedback like your score is 15. You realize, well, that's not very good. I recalled 3 words. I recalled 2 words. I could probably do better than that. So you kind of learn how to do better on this task, and I think that's why feedback is important here. We've also examined this in very early stage Alzheimer's disease. So these are older adults who are still fairly high functioning at an EDRC in St. Louis, at Washington University in St. Louis. This is work done with Dave Belota and Dave McCabe. Same sort of task, but you might expect Alzheimer's, people who have very early diagnoses of Alzheimer's, have trouble controlling attention. So like I mentioned previously, it might be difficult to say, oh, that word's only worth 1 or 2 points, I want to ignore it. People with Alzheimer's disease might say, well, it's still something worthwhile that I should attend to. Or worse, if it's presented at the end of the list, it's fresh in memory, so they recall it right away, but then might not recall many of the other words. And we find that these healthy older adults are attending to value quite well. People with very early Alzheimer's disease still attend to value. They're recalling more of the 12-point words than they are the lower value words. But in fact, they're recalling the lower value words more often than the healthy older adults. So it's kind of an interesting way to show that maybe what happens with Alzheimer's disease is an impairment in controlling attention and attending to important or high-value information. So some extensions of this that we've been looking at is, well, how much awareness do we have over this, or how much control can we have over this? So in this new experiment that we're doing, you can choose which word value pairs you try to remember. So instead of them going so quickly, I'm going to present a word and its value, and you need to bet on it. Okay, so if I say apple is worth 10 points, if you say yes, I'm going to accept that bet. If you recall apple later, you get 10 points. But if you fail to recall apple later, you're going to lose 10 points. Okay, so it's a little bit like gambling on your memory. Which ones are you going to bet on, and which ones are you going to say, no, that's either too risky for me, or oh, I don't want to bet on the low value ones. So which words would you bet on, and also how many would you bet on? So this is kind of a slightly different task. But we can then measure which words people bet on and also what their score is. So if you bet on a lot of words but don't recall all of them, your score could potentially be negative. But again, we give people many lists, different words, and we're interested in how people might change. So it's almost a metacognitive measure of how much can you remember and which ones do you want to bet on. If you're not very confident about your memory, maybe you'll bet on some of the lower value ones, which is something we thought older adults might do. And this is work that's still in progress. I'll just show you the average score. So this is the score that you get at the end of the list. Like I said, it could be negative if you bet on more words than you actually recall. And this is as a function of lists. So you get a list, you're told your score, then you're given another list, different words. We do this 6 times in this case. Younger adults start out fairly low, so their mean score is about 12. All right, so they probably bet on a few more than they can actually remember, but they get much better. So as they learn about the task, let's say, or learn about how many words they should bet on, maybe 4 or 5, and which ones. Maybe they get more confident as they go. Older adults start off betting on more words than they actually remember, and their score in many cases is negative. But I think what's interesting is that older adults improve, just like the younger adults, and actually catch up with the younger adults at some point. Possibly by betting on fewer words, but on betting on the high value words. So we're excited about this sort of finding because it looks like it's like training metacognition, or training you about how your own memory works. That maybe I shouldn't focus on many words, but focus on the important ones. Or maybe I'll focus on the middle value ones, or maybe only the ones I know I can remember because they fit some sort of story I'm making while I'm trying to remember the words. Yeah?
Do you think it could also be, older adults haven't engaged in that kind of thinking activity in a long time and you're just resurrecting it, whereas younger adults are maybe recently out of school and that's why, or more competitive, or they're more focused on this kind of thing?
Yeah, certainly. That's a good global explanation, I think, for what might be going on here. I think anytime you use point values, you kind of get people a little more competitive. It also makes people aware, especially when you give them feedback, especially when it's feedback that your score is negative, and you realize, oh, well, I can fix that. And you're right, maybe younger adults are already in this, but younger adults aren't doing great to begin with. But yeah, I think that's certainly a possibility. Yeah?
Does the characteristic of the list matter? Like if there are more categories versus fewer categories, completely unrelated words?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've tried to norm the words so they're all kind of neutral, common nouns, but we have looked at this in the context of remembering emotional information. So there's a big literature showing that older adults can remember emotional information and might even focus differentially on positive information, some of the work by Mara Mather and others. So we've tried to look at this by saying, well, what if we make emotional words, positive emotional words, worth low points? Okay, so now can older adults say, well, those positive emotional words, I'm really good at remembering them, or they form a category that I can rely on, but they're not worth so much. I'm better off remembering neutral words. And it turns out that we get these sorts of same functions, that at first older adults will recall a few of the emotional words, probably because they pop out, but after 2 or 3 lists they realize ignore emotional words, focus on these neutral words. So that's one way we've tried to get at that. There's a few other manipulations we've used where we've kept the words neutral, but we've actually made some words worth negative points. So if you recall these words, you're going to be penalized. So you really want to ignore these words. So some of these words are low value, you'd say like 1 or 2 points. If you recall them, fine. It's not worth much. In this case, some of these words are worth -5 or -10, so you really want to ignore them. And older adults are actually fairly good at that. Okay? Probably because there's many other words to focus on. On the other hand, what was interesting, on a later recognition test, surprise recognition test, where we present all of the words, older adults were better at recognizing the words we told them to ignore. Okay? So those words were still getting into the system, which might be consistent with inhibitory control, but older adults weren't recalling them. So kind of an interesting finding. Okay, so in this case, older adults might have been overconfident at first, and this might be a metacognitive failure, not knowing how many words to bet on or betting on high-value words. But with practice and feedback, both younger and older adults learn to focus on high-value items and bet appropriately. So this might be related to issues about awareness of capacity, or how much you can remember, and the need to try and achieve the highest possible payoff. So I think feedback here is really important, letting older adults know how they're doing, how they could do better. Okay, we're going to return to how people remember faces. So now we've tried to say, well, how about these faces that older adults have trouble remembering or recognizing? Are there ways that we can differentially influence how we remember faces? So we developed this game where you need to remember how much each person owes you. Okay, so people in this game owe you money. If you later recall how much they owe you, you get the money. All right? So this person owes you $50, but this person owes you $1,000. Okay? So you can already see, if you want to collect as much money as you can, you might want to really focus on remembering this person's face. In this case, we show 14 faces. Each face is paired with a value ranging from 0 to 1,000. So some people don't owe you any money. You might not want to pay attention to them. And we tell people it's important to remember the faces that owe you the most amount of money so you can later collect this money. So now you just try and recall how much this person owes, $50, but this person owes you $1,000. This is still work in progress. This is the estimated value owed. So this is the guess that you would make, whether it's correct or incorrect, average. This is the actual value owed. What's interesting is older adults are actually fairly good at looking for these cases that owe you the most amount of money. On the flip side, older adults might also incorrectly say that someone who owes them $10 owes them $200. Okay? So there might be trade-offs in terms of trying to remember these sorts of situations where someone owes you a lot of money or they don't owe you a lot, and this might be related to source information. We thought of extending this to situations where you actually owe someone money as well. So maybe you want to avoid those cases, right? You really don't want to attend to that case, or maybe you really want to because you want to pay them back. But still, work in progress. And there may be some applications of value-directed remembering. One possibility is older adults may take different types of medication. And there's many side effects, sometimes unknown side effects, that can lead to hospitalization. How can we present information such that older adults can remember the important side effects? So if there's a list of side effects, like all of these side effects, you might say, oh, there's just a lot of side effects. We'll just either try and remember all of them or maybe not try and remember any of them. But what if we change the format such that it's important to remember the side effects that happen the most often? Okay, so in order from most common to least common. So if you can only remember a few side effects, or if your doctor says, look, if you're nauseous after taking this, I want you to call me. So you need to remember that side effect. But you don't need to worry so much about a sore throat or these sorts of things. Can we use value-directed remembering to try and remember the more common ones? Another condition might be where font size indicates prevalence rates. So this would be very perceptually informative. So the more common side effects are just in bigger font than the ones that aren't as common. And then one where the prevalence rates are actually listed. So you can say, well, dizziness is really going to happen fairly often. After I put this experiment together, I realized Food and Drug Administration would never approve a drug where dizziness happens 58% of the time. But I'm learning, right? But really, when you look at how medication side effects are listed, they're listed in a long paragraph form typically. And they're listed in small font, so most people I don't think even read them. So this might be a situation where if you can only remember 3 or 4 side effects, it might be important to kind of list these side effects. One thing that we're not taking into account is this is just how prevalent these side effects are. Maybe we should put the side effects that are life-threatening in large font. Or look, if you have chest pains, let us know. That's something we really need to watch out for. That's still something we need to work on. So in summary, value-directed remembering. Well, in many cases, older adults remember less information or might false alarm more often to rearranged items. But older adults can learn to focus on remembering important or high-value information. This might have to do with experience or feedback. And value-directed remembering can lead to this efficient use of memory in old age. So I'll end just with a quote. This is something that a colleague sent me. A colleague who's on sabbatical reading, apparently. But it's a triumph of life that old people lose their memories of inessential things, but memory does not often fail with regards to the things that are of real interest to us. Cicero illustrated this with the stroke of a pen. No old man or woman forgets where he has hidden his treasure. All right, thank you very much. Yeah.
Are there differences in the use of strategies? Like, I found myself with when you had to value the numbers up there. First of all, I had to guess what the range would be.
Right, you're learning about that.
So you learn that quickly. And but I was repeating I picked the ones that were above 9.
Yeah.
I said, I'm going to concentrate on that. I'm not sure when I hit that point. But I was actively rehearsing that in my mind.
Yeah.
So that's a strategy.
Definitely.
Do younger people, are younger people better at that generally, or is it?
I think younger people are more likely to spontaneously do that. That sort of strategy older adults use quite effectively, rote rehearsal, kind of rehearsing the ones that were high value. And they would learn to do that in successive lists. Sometimes younger adults would say, oh, I tried to make images or pictures or relate them all together. But as a result, they'd sometimes relate words that were of low value. So definitely strategy use is going on there. The type of mnemonic used might be different for younger and older adults. And I think the literature suggests younger adults are more likely to engage in spontaneous use of mnemonics, whereas older adults will use them, but you kind of have to suggest them, or they need to realize that they're effective. Yeah. But I think there's a real strategy there.
So you could instruct or suggest. I think there's been years since I've read this stuff with kids, with children who are on the retarded end. You can improve their memory or other cognitive functions by teaching them strategies.
Yeah.
And so it's the whole remedial educational aspect of all of this, teaching strategies, and maybe older people can be, these things, I think you just said, they can be taught some of these things.
Definitely.
The younger people using more routinely, perhaps because of where they are in life.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah,
We're trying to do some of this work with ADHD kids too, because attentional control could be an issue here.
Nicole, one question?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had taken any measures of executive function so that you could see if, in fact, cognitive control is responsible for these changes.
Yeah, that's a great question. In the last set of data that I presented with the Alzheimer's patients, we had some psychometric tests, so some measures, also working memory as well. And working memory seemed to predict memory for the high-value information, but not memory for the low-value information, which suggests that this is probably related to controlled attention. But yeah, I think that might be the real mechanism behind this. Can you kind of control attention and focus on the high-value information, maintain this in working memory? We haven't done that where we introduce these distractors that are negative value or any of these manipulations that might really test that in more detail, but I think that's what's going on, and those sorts of measures are important for that. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Did you ever measure effort? So ask them how hard did you try? Maybe it was more important for the older adults to improve themselves on memory tasks?
Yeah, I think that might play a big role. It's so hard to kind of measure effort other than looking at kind of point scores. But I think just from testing some of these people, older adults would really want to achieve a high score. So some people say, well, why would people care? It's just points. And it's like, no, actually people feel, especially when it's their memory, they really want to maximize performance. So older adults might be engaging in a lot of effort here. I think younger adults are as well. But I think effort might be important because in those unrelated base pairs, older adults are kind of sitting there thinking, they don't go together, so I don't really do any processing to try and remember them. But some sort of measure of effort is sometimes elusive. That's a good point. Yes, two more? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, your last point, I think in the slide before, you said that it showed that older adults can be taught how to remember value.
Mm-hmm.
But earlier you showed that they actually remember value better than the young adults.
Yeah.
Am I confusing something?
No, I think the important thing is with successive lists and feedback. So
I mean, because they actually outdid the younger adults.
yeah, towards the end. Yeah. So that first graph I showed kind of collapsed overall 24 lists where.
I was thinking of the one with the, what do you call these things? Bar graph.
The bar graphs.
Yeah.
With the grocery prices there.
I don't remember. It showed a comparison. It was the only one where older adults, I think it was in the, I think it was the price. I think it was market price,
Right,
overpriced,
yeah.
underpriced, and the older adults actually did better than the younger ones.
Yeah, I think in those cases maybe older adults just learned to use these strategies effectively.
Or maybe they've been using them more over their life.
Frequently, yeah. And some people will say, well, grocery prices, maybe college students aren't so interested.
Well, I haven't had much experience.
That's what some people say.
Yeah, they
just
don't pay
swiping
the
it.
bills and they don't have any experience.
Right, exactly. But they still have enough experience to know that ice cream isn't $17.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I hope we all know that.
Yeah, yeah. So there's one other question, then go
Have
ahead.
you ever looked at the educational differences and also the effects it might be have some racial differences if you show African American or Latino American?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll take, there is an own race bias, so people are typically better with their own race in terms of identifying faces. We didn't look at that because our sample in the older adults wasn't diverse enough. And your other question about education is, we do get those data, but we haven't really looked at whether there's much of a difference. Again, this is a highly educated older adult sample, probably the same type of sample you have here that you work with. But I think education might predict a lot of these effects. Especially the ones with feedback and trying to improve performance. Yeah. Yes?
When you give value to the list items, do you still observe recency and...
Yeah, good question. So this task was actually developed to see if you could get rid of primacy and recency effects. Forget about younger and older adults. What if I make, people typically remember the first few items in the list and the last few items in the list. What if I make those items low value, make the ones in the middle high value? Can we get rid of primacy and recency effects? And it turns out you can, which I think is interesting. On the flip side, some of the Alzheimer's individuals rely strongly on recency effects. So if the last word was presented was a 12, they'll get it. But if the last word that was presented was a 1 or a 2, they'll also get it. So it's like they can engage in the same degree of value-directed remembering because they're just relying on recency. So I think that's an important point. I didn't present any of the serial position graphs, but that is really an important thing to pay attention to, or presenting a delay after the last item.